So the topic of today's ArtStop is Buddhism from India to China. And as you all know, that Buddhism was founded in the 5th century in India. And there was an actual historical person by the name of Siddhartha Gautama, who was a prince in a kingdom in northeastern India, just north of the Ganges River, who decided to renounce his life as a prince and go off into the forest and seek enlightenment. Enlightenment meaning the path to escape from our lives of constant cycles of birth and death and rebirth, which inevitably always lead to some form of suffering. Even if there's happiness for a short period of time, it always is impermanent, and always some kind of sadness or suffering, death and destruction inevitably takes place. So how to get true freedom from the attachments and trammels of cyclic existence. And so this is what Siddhartha Gautama did. When he went and sat under the Bodhi tree, he achieved enlightenment, figured out the true nature of reality and a way to achieve nirvana, which is release, or the eternal blissful state that's free of all suffering outside the realm of cyclical existence. So he lived in the 5th century BC in India, but it wasn't until about the 1st century or so that we actually have images of the Buddha that begin being made in India. And also then shortly thereafter in a region of Pakistan known as Gandhara at that time. And these works that we see here and then at the entrance as well, made out of this distinctive gray schist, are some of the earliest representations of the Buddha. And the forms are very much a kind of hybrid in terms of style between Greco-Roman prototypes that were being brought by Roman traders connecting up the Indus River up to the Silk Road to China, and local indigenous Indian forms. And so we see, the garments of the Buddha, which are the monks' robes of the Buddha, that look almost like a Roman toga of the same period, of the 1st to 2nd centuries. So, it was in the 1st century that the Romans discovered a sea route that led from the coast of Africa, the eastern coast of Africa, to the mouth of the Indus River during monsoon season in a trip that would take only 2 weeks. This was extremely quick in terms of traversing that far a distance. And the other advantage of taking this sea route is that the Romans were able to circumvent the Parthian Empire. These overland routes were very dangerous, and the Parthians themselves levied very heavy taxes on the traders and caravans that would be going across their territories. And so the Romans, who are the only ones who were able to understand the technology of shipbuilding well enough to create ships that were strong enough to withstand the gale forces of the monsoon winds, were able to make this 2-week journey to the mouth of the Indus River, sail up the Indus River, but it's a dangerous journey, and they would bring with them small movable sculptures, usually made of bronze, of their own deities that were dressed with Roman garments and made in Roman naturalistic styles. And because of all the wealth that was moving with these mercantile caravans and with these traders through this region, a lot of Buddhist monasteries received a great deal of patronage and were therefore able to afford a great array of embellishment. And so we have sculptures of scenes from the life of the Buddha, princely figures, all done in this very naturalistic style with garments that are very much inspired by Roman prototypes. Now, as they were going up the Indus River, they would also then cross the Hindu Kush, which is the pass through the mountains up to Afghanistan, and then from Afghanistan connect with the Silk Road that would head east to China. And it was the movement of the luxury goods, primarily silk from China, ivories and spices from India, and then gold, basically money and glass and things like that from Rome that would be going back and forth along this route. So it was really the Silk Road and the mercantile activities along the Silk Road that led to the spread of Buddhism north and then eventually eastward to China. Now, it's very interesting that in India, Buddhism really doesn't survive at all past the 13th century. And there was a particular form of Buddhism that developed in the Gandharan region of Pakistan that later became called Mahayana. Mahayana is the form of Buddhism that failed in India, and so it went off to China, to flourish in China. And so I'll take you now into our Echoes of the Past gallery. So this new type of Buddhism that used different texts and had a different emphasis that developed first as a kind of a splinter group in northern India didn't receive much of a following in India because there were establishment monasteries that were much more powerful and that they preferred to hang on to their older way of running a Buddhist community. And so these so-called Mahayana Buddhists started moving across the Silk Road along the trade routes of the Silk Road and establishing their own settlements and converting local populations along the way in Central Asia. So there would be new monasteries that would crop up in places like Kizil and Bezeklik and Urumqi across the Tarim Basin of Central Asia, and then down into which led finally down into the Gobi Desert of Western China, and then to the capital then of Xi'an. And then Buddhism started getting a foothold when certain kings would then be converted to Buddhism, such as kings of the Northern Wei dynasty of China, and then sponsor major foundations, temples, and monasteries with embellishments as well and sculptures as well. And Buddhism eventually became a state religion in China and became a very popular religion for many of the inhabitants of China. But still, the Buddhist monks who were spreading from India to China, this Mahayana ideal, they were bringing texts that would bring descriptions of bodhisattvas and monks and scenes from the life of the Buddha that were then being translated from the Indian language of Sanskrit into Chinese. And so the descriptions of, for example, what a bodhisattva looks like would then be translated into Chinese and then taken on by the Chinese craftsmen and artists and sculptors. So this is an example of a bodhisattva that was carved in China at this cave temple site of Xiangtangshan. Now the whole idea of a cave temple is one that also was brought from India to China. Cave temples had been made in India since at least the 3rd century BC, and sometimes entire temple and monastery complexes would be carved into the mountainsides in western India, eastern India, and southern India as well. And so this idea of having a monastery temple complex carved out of the mountainside is one that was brought to China, and Xiangtangshan is one of the examples of a 6th century group of cave temples where the sculptures were sponsored by the ruling Qi dynasty of the 6th century. And in the Buddhist texts that were brought from India, it said that one of the greatest ideals of a perfected Buddhist being is one who decides not to even achieve enlightenment at all, but instead gets very close to final enlightenment, but decides to hold back that last step and remain in the world of birth and death called samsara. But they're so far along on the path to enlightenment that they're able to control where they're born and reborn in order that they can be most compassionate and help other beings achieve enlightenment first. So this idea of the Bodhisattva ideal, the Bodhisattva is the being who is one step prior to becoming a total, fully enlightened Buddha. The Bodhisattva Ideal is held up by this group of Mahayana Buddhists that went to China as being one of the greatest ideals. And bodhisattvas are described in the Buddhist texts as looking like a prince, reflective of the first part of Siddhartha's life when he was a prince, right before he achieved final enlightenment. So we have here a Chinese artist's rendition of the Indian description of a bodhisattva or a prince, with a crown, with ribbons tied to the hair, and with strings of jewels, a necklace, and jewels running around the whole form of the body. The garments themselves are Indian-style garments rather than Chinese garments. Indian garments consist of a dhoti, which is a lower garment that's just tied around, wrapped and tied around the waist when the ends hang down the center, and then the upper garment, like a shawl, is just draped over the shoulders. Now, this particular bodhisattva has long locks of hair that are falling over the shoulders, and here we have an over life-size example in this exhibition that would have been the focus of one of the most popular sites for Buddhist devotion that continues to be popular to this day. I think we're out of time. I can take some questions if you like. I'm sorry, I forgot to bring my watch.
I had people ask me today that caves weren't at all because they were hiding Buddhism.
Oh, no, not at all. They're just, the caves are kind of stand-in for structural temples. Right.
Were the temples inside the caves made as temples, or the caves were the temples?
The caves were carved out to be the rooms of the temple themselves, and there would have been wooden facades that were attached to the front of each mouth of the cave. So they were not natural caves, they were all man-made caves, intended to be kind of architectural spaces, just carved out of the living rock. Right. Another question?
Significance to the fact that most of these statues have their eyes closed?
Oh, they're not closed. They're in an introspective gaze. So it's a kind of meditative downward gaze. So if any of you has ever practiced yoga, you're supposed to kind of look downwards to about an inch out from the tip of your nose, and therefore concentrate and not be distracted by looking at what is around one. Yes, another question?
That's why the monks shave their head?
Monks shave the head. It's the tonsure that shows that they are that they've renounced ordinary society.
This one has long hair.
Because it is a bodhisattva, not a monk. And so bodhisattvas are shown in the form of a prince, which is a lay person, not a monk.
And is a Chinese Bodhisattva definitively male or female?
Bodhisattvas have transcended gender. So they're beyond all of these kind of ordinary distinctions that we live by in our ordinary society. So, but usually in the text they're talked about as male, but that's more of a grammatical issue. But in terms of actual substance, they're considered to be beyond the gender distinction.
Isn't it a female figure of a Buddha too? I think the Chinese Buddhism is a female figure.
Later on, Chinese Buddha, by the 16th or 17th century, they take the Bodhisattva Guanyin and make it into a female mother goddess kind of figure. But that's sort of in popular Buddhist piety. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.